talk about, obviously, today are looking at ISO 14155, comparing it to ICH, looking at where those gaps kind of get filled in and what might be distinctly different between the two. We know that ICH is written really for drugs, but because it is a good set of scientific and ethical standards, we incorporate that into our research of our clinical research for medical devices. So we're going to talk about the purpose and governing bodies of both ICH and ISO. We'll look at the core principles of each document. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to look at those key differences and any similarities, and also look at additional resources for information. Because ISO is a registered product, I'll obviously be able to download everything into this slide deck. I want you to be aware of it enough so that you can determine whether or not it's something that would be useful for you for purchasing. But ISO is a worldwide federation of national standards bodies. So the U.S., of course, is an ISO member. We had ISO 14155 adopted in 2001. Prior to this, we had parts 1 and 2, which were the good clinical practice standards for the conduct and oversight of human research studies involving medical devices. So the definition here, or the title of this, Clinical Investigation of Medical Devices for Human Subjects, GCP. Obviously, ISO is a set of standards, right? The International Standards Organizations, looking at good clinical practice for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting those clinical investigations that we use to assess safety, efficacy, performance of our medical devices for those regulatory purposes. Not housed under FDA, as we would see 21 CFR 812, but again, complementary in terms of what we are looking for. We know that there are updates coming, or pending rather, to 812 as it speaks to those non-IDE studies conducted outside the U.S. Now they say that they need to be conducted in accordance with the Declaration of Helsinki, but the push is, just like we saw in drugs several years ago, to ensure that our studies are conducted in accordance with good clinical practice. So these standards, or this standard, specifies general requirements that are meant to protect the right, safety, and welfare of human subjects engaged in these types of research, ensure that we have scientific conduct of those studies, and that the data that is being produced is credible. Looking at the responsibilities of both the sponsor and the principal investigator, and it's really intended as a tool for sponsors, investigators, ethics committees, regulatory authorities, and other bodies that are involved in assessing compliance with the conduct and oversight of these studies. So some of the things to consider. Clinical investigations need to be conducted in accordance with the ethical principle that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki. And what is of interest, as I just mentioned, is that there's a change in moving away from just the Declaration of Helsinki and saying that we have to conduct these studies in accordance with good clinical practice. But good clinical practice incorporates Declaration of Helsinki. So we're moving beyond that. Rather than just that limited scope of one document, we're taking into consideration certainly the regulations, the guidelines, state and local laws, medical standard of care, everything that we use to, I would think of it in terms of building tensile strengths to the safety net that we're building around our subjects and our data. So these principles are meant to protect the right, safety, and well-being of those subjects, and they are the most important considerations for science and society. When we look at ICH, we will see very similar definitions. These principles should be understood, observed, and applied at every step in the clinical investigation. So really building that quality into our studies as we move along, building that ethical oversight as well. One thing that ISO talks about in greater detail than we see in ICH and even in the regulations is looking at improper influence or inducement. So it says the sponsor shall avoid improper influence on or inducement of the subject, the monitor, any investigators or other parties that are participating in or contributing to the clinical investigation. The way the regulations are set up, we are looking at the potential to minimize coercion or undue influence for participation in this study for a research participant under 21 CFR Part 50 for informed consent. ICH expands that a little bit further and talks about minimizing or really eliminating the potential for coercion or undue influence for participation and continued participation of that participant under ICH E6 4.8. But ISO takes into consideration that we are all in a position of potential pressure. So there should not be improper influence on or inducement of not just the subject, but the monitor, the investigators, or anyone else who's involved in the study. And investigators need to avoid improper influence on or inducement of the subject, sponsor, monitor, or other investigators or other parties. So we're really looking at this in terms of a dynamic where the sponsor and the investigator both have responsibilities to ensure that they are keeping to themselves, if you will, in terms of what is required of them to do their due diligence, move forward, in a collaborative effort, but not using that position to force people to do things that they do not want to do.